I'm Eric Tars. I'm the director of the Human Rights and Children's Rights Programs at the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty. And we're here today to talk about how we and others are taking a human rights approach to homelessness, using strategies at the international, national, state, and local levels to address homelessness in a new and different way that says that housing is a fundamental human right. So just to start off, we at the National Law Center are the legal arm of the national movement to end and prevent homelessness. And as a national organization, we believe it is essential for us to start talking about housing as a human right, because otherwise we are never going to get to the place where we can accomplish our mission of ending and preventing homelessness. And that's whether we're using it in policy advocacy, in litigation, or doing public education as we're doing here today. And this is why over the past 10 years we've been doing national, regional, local trainings on the human right to housing. We've been putting out reports. I've got a number of them up here that were out on the table and say display copy only, but I don't want to have to cart them home with me, so please feel free to come up and take these at the end of the session. And we've been actually going to the international level and bringing international officials here to the U.S. To talk about, highlight the issues of homelessness, and start having a conversation about housing as a human right. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about the definition of the right to housing, where it came from, how people are actually using human rights strategies as part of their advocacy, and the difference that it can make, both examples from abroad and from right here in the U.S. And contrary to some people who would have you believe otherwise, the right to housing definitely does come from a very American origin, starting with Franklin Delano Roosevelt's Second Bill of Rights speech. And we think this is very important. There's been some polling research done that shows that American audiences really respond to this notion that this is something about who we are as Americans. We have a duty to our fellow citizens to ensure that they aren't without their basic needs. But after Franklin Roosevelt's 1944 speech, this was embodied at the international level as part of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, and then put into a binding treaty, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, a few years later. The U.S. has signed but not ratified this treaty, and we can talk about the legal differences between signing and ratification, and between a declaration and a treaty later. But it's a very well-established principle at the international level. And the right to housing is more than just four walls and a roof over your head. At the international level, the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which oversees the implementation of the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, has established 7 elements of the right to housing, so that it's a comprehensive right. It talks about legal security of tenure, how secure you are, and that can be whether you're a renter, a homeowner, or even a person living in an informal encampment. You should have some security in where you're staying. Affordability is a relative standard. It means that, and it's inherently related to the enjoyment of your other human rights. So if you have to choose between adequate, nutritious food and paying your rent, or necessary medications and paying your rent, that's a violation both of the right to food or the right to health and of the right to housing. Location, housing isn't just about where you're living in isolation, but it's about the community around you and your access to other services in the community. So all of these elements all fit together to make up the right to housing. And it allows us to work across issues areas. So whether you're talking about renters' rights or homelessness or public housing, all of these are coming together, and we can join our voices together through using the human rights framework. We have been using human rights advocacy successfully to make concrete changes at the local, the state, and the federal levels. Our colleagues in Minneapolis, or Madison, Wisconsin, passed a resolution 2 years ago that declared housing is a human right within the city of Madison and then within Dane County, which is a county around Madison. And in the 2 years since then, as federal and state budgets have shrunk, the advocates locally have used this resolution to actually expand county and city level services. So there's more shelters, there's warming shelters in the winter. They're trying to get more affordable housing dollars. So this, they've passed this resolution, which is just a rhetorical resolution, but they're really holding their city accountable to it. And Ken will talk a little bit more about later. The city of Eugene also adopted a similar document, not a city resolution, but part of their Opportunity Eugene Task Force output document that recognize housing as a basic human right. And again, the local advocates there are using this as part of their accountability strategies. This past summer, we actually got a resolution adopted by the American Bar Association and another one by the International Association of Official Human Rights Agencies, which is made up of state and local human rights commissions. If your mayor or your city councilors or anybody else are lawyers, and if they're members of the American Bar Association, this is part of their official policy now. If you have a state or local human rights commission in your area, they have it as a part of their official mandate that they should be promoting housing as a human right. They should be addressing issues of criminalization of homelessness in a positive manner rather than a criminalizing manner. And these are tools that people can use. They're just words on paper, but they're only as effective as we make them as advocates. So it's necessary to actually use these tools in our advocacy. In addition to the resolutions, we've had substantive legislation passed. In the past 2 years, Rhode Island, Illinois, and Connecticut have all passed homeless bills of rights. There's an even better version of the Bill of Rights that's been proposed in California and Oregon. These are concrete tools that people are organizing around to try and oppose the criminalization of human rights and then move to the next step, which would be enforcement of housing as a human right. We're also using international mechanisms to try and shine an international spotlight on issues of housing and homelessness. This is Tim Buckley, an advocate and formerly homeless person in Sacramento, California, speaking at a press conference following a visit from the UN Special Rapporteur on Water and Sanitation. They got incredible media coverage as the Special Rapporteur came to do a site visit and looked at how Sacramento was actually shutting down public bathrooms and drinking fountains to prevent homeless people from using them and try and force them out of the city. She put out a report that not only highlighted the local issues and that the local advocates were able to use to really change the entire political playing field, really empowering them in their advocacy. But also we got very strategic language in it, calling the criminalization of homelessness cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment, which is kind of the international level equivalent of our own Eighth Amendment cruel and unusual standard. And this is important so that we can use it in our litigation as well as in our other policy advocacy. These special rapporteur visits are great opportunities to shine this international spotlight, get the media attention, but also to get this strategic language that can be useful in many ways down the road. We are also working at the federal level to advance our own domestic law. In 2012, the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness, which is made up of the Department of Justice, HUD, Veterans Administration, Health and Human Services, other agencies, put out a report on the alternatives to the criminalization of homelessness that for the first time of any domestic agency report actually says that in addition to violating constitutional law, criminalization of homelessness may violate our international human rights treaties obligations. I can't emphasize how huge it is that domestic agencies are talking now about homelessness as a potential treaty rights violation. And we've actually moved even further beyond this. Coming out this next week, the Interagency Council is doing an entire blog series around International Human Rights Day, talking about what do human rights mean to me, where they've invited guest bloggers from all of these agencies to write about housing and homelessness and criminalization of homelessness as a human rights issue. We are actually changing the way our government is talking about homelessness. And there's a lot of potential there that can be followed up on. In addition, our courts are looking at human rights language as they are making decisions. In Roper v. Simmons on the juvenile death penalty, Justice Kennedy devoted a full quarter of his decision to discussing international and comparative legal standards. And we are working to put this into these strategies into some of our amicus briefs around the foreclosure crisis, around access to housing in public housing for renters' rights. So these are legal standards. It's a very unexplored field, but we continue to try and press the envelope there. So all of this is well and good, but what difference does it make? Just for a comparative example, in Scotland, they passed a law there in 2003 that said everybody has the right to housing. It's a legally enforceable right. If you are homeless in Scotland, you go to a social service agency, they have to provide you with housing for as long as you need it, with whatever services you require. Even if you aren't, homeless by our U.S. definition yet, the Scotland definition of homelessness includes people at risk of homelessness, people in overcrowded situations, people experiencing domestic violence who don't have a safe place, even if they officially have a lease in their name. And it's a completely different culture there. They still have a few homeless people, who are out on the streets, but by and large, they have actually, over the past 10 years, eliminated homelessness in the ways that we experience it here in the U.S. In South Africa, they have a constitutional right to housing that's explicitly informed by international human rights standards. And this has been used by lawyers so that squatters in buildings or on land that they don't even own can't be evicted unless other alternative adequate housing is provided to them. In some cases where the police have come in and torn down shanty towns, encampments, like they do all the time with tent cities in the US, they actually ordered the police to go back and rebuild the houses on the land that the people didn't even own in the first place and allow them to stay there until other adequate alternatives were provided. And if you can just think about a US judge ordering a US police chief to rebuild a tent encampment after he's gone through and swept it out, I think that shows this is the difference that having a right to housing makes. And this is why all of us as advocates need to start talking about housing as a human right. And spreading that framework as an alternative to what we have here. In addition, we've been working at the international level. We put out this report, Cruel, Inhuman, and Degrading, which again takes this international language very strategically to talk about the criminalization of homelessness in this way. And we used it. It just came out this past fall, and just as we were about to go to publication, we had a report from some of our allies in South Carolina that the city of Columbia approved this new plan where they would literally ban homeless people from the entire downtown area. Police would be able to take them, ship them out to a homeless shelter outside of the city, and they were going to station a police officer in between the shelter and downtown and not allow homeless people to go back downtown unless they could prove they had an appointment. Clearly a human rights violation to just ban people from public areas of their own city. And as we started to gear up our advocacy on this, we discovered that the mayor of Columbia, South Carolina, had actually sponsored a resolution at the U.S. Conference of Mayors conference the previous year that encouraged mayors to implement human rights standards at the local level, including the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which is what our report was about. So we included language from about the Columbia situation in our report, and our local allies were able to take that information back to the mayor and say, look, you are doing something exactly opposed to what you said you dedicated yourself to in this resolution. And walking out of that meeting, the mayor reversed his support for the plan, and ultimately the Columbia City Council took it off the table. So we stopped this ordinance from happening using these human rights standards. They can be effective as tools. So I'm happy to talk more. I want to give my colleagues a chance to talk, but this is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of what's going on at the international, national, local, and state levels. Please be in touch. Please take our materials, and we'll talk more in the questions session.
Okay. Again, I'm Ken Neubeck from the Eugene, Oregon Human Rights Commission. I'm also a member of the Human Rights at Home campaign, which is working to the subcommittee on state and local coordination, which is working to use state and local human rights commissions to use those commissions as sort of a conduit for bringing human rights home at the state and local level. So, I have a microphone. Okay, thank you. So I'll give you a very brief description of Eugene and kind of move on from that to what's going on with regard to homelessness, and particularly the criminalization of homelessness, and some of the things that we're doing to combat that. How many people here have ever been to Eugene? Oh, a few people, a couple people, okay. Eugene is a city in Oregon of about 160,000 people. It's got a poverty rate of 22%. It's an overwhelmingly white Anglo city with a growing Latino population. It's known as sort of a progressive type of city because of activities on the part of anarchists and pro-environmental people and anti-war groups over time and so forth. But it's my experience there, living there in the last 10 years, is it's kind of mixed politically. We have a weak mayor system, and this is kind of important to telling the story here. A weak mayor system in Eugene, which means that the power rests with the city council, the 8-member city council. The mayor's power really is to vote on ties, which can be very important. The mayor is quite liberal. The city council is broken into sort of a liberal wing and a conservative wing. The city council makes the general policy priorities, and we have a city manager who carries out the nitty-gritty of those things from day to day. And in theory, at least, the council is not supposed to intrude on the decisions that are made by the city manager. And I think, in general, that's the case. The Human Rights Commission, on which I serve, Human Rights Commissions differ from place to place. Our Human Rights Commission basically is an advisory body to the City Council. It's appointed by members of the City Council. It has a mandate to do community outreach and community education. And since 2007, roughly around the time that I joined the Human Rights Commission, the Commission's been pushing human rights in the broadest possible sense, and implementation of human rights in the city organization, which basically means the city bureaucracy, as well as out in the community. I mean, historically, the Human Rights Commission had been really a civil rights commission focusing upon discrimination. And when I joined the commission, I kind of urged people to begin thinking more broadly about the human rights concept, similar to Martin Luther King's statement, we've moved from the era of civil rights to the era of human rights. This is what I wanted the commission to do, and they have since done that. There's been a lot of buy-in to this notion of broadening the concept by the city council and by the city manager in terms of implementing a broader human rights framework within the city. And people talk about the desirability of making Eugene a human rights city. Other cities, Pittsburgh, Boston, Seattle, several other ones, have passed resolutions proclaiming themselves a human rights city. I always am suspicious of whether or not that really means anything down on the ground. We've started the other way to get to work with city staff and city employees that get them incorporating human rights principles and concepts in the 6 city departments, and have held back from saying that we are a human rights city. We aspire to be a human rights city. The issue of homelessness is something that's grown over time. I'm sure wherever you're all from, you've seen it increase. And the issue emerges as an issue in Eugene in 2009 with the opening of Eugene warming centers. These are warming centers that open up when the temperature drops below 30 degrees, which is not particularly common in Eugene. But this week, the entire week, it's been below 30. In fact, I think last night it was 8 degrees in Eugene last night. And it's totally volunteer run. The city donates a little money to it, but it's totally, it occurs in churches and synagogues. I think there's 5 or 6 different sites at this point in time. It occurred because Colonel Egan, who was a reserve Army officer, died in the snow. He was homeless, died in the snow, and people were just absolutely shocked. He wasn't certainly the first one to die, or the last. But the Egan Warming Center was a response to that. And I think it's key to me because this is the first time that the faith communities began to step forward and to sort of legitimize doing something about homelessness as an important type of step. The city council listens to people like that. The next thing that occurred, which sort of ratcheted up the interest in homelessness as an issue, was activities in 2011 and 2012 by Occupy Eugene. Occupy Eugene followed the Occupy Wall Street movement, and one of the first things they did was to establish a protest camp near downtown, which immediately began to attract people who were unhoused. Not only was it sort of safe, but there was free food, and people were welcomed. People who are unhoused are part of the 99% that, after all, Occupy Wall Street and Occupy Eugene had interest in and wanted to express their voices. So that began to develop. In 2011, the council approved a new ordinance, revives the 20-year-old human rights ordinance in the city, to give the Human Rights Commission the mandate to address the full range of human rights that are found in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So while we could have been doing some things on homelessness, and I think we did do some forums and things like that, now we had a full mandate to address things like the right to housing as of 2011. In 2011, the mayor also appointed a mayoral commission, a task force, on homelessness. It had 58 members, which included people from the business community, people from faith communities, people from the advocacy community, people from Occupy, Human Rights Commission members. I mean, it was a real panoply of people from all different places to give advice on what should be done about homelessness in the city of Eugene. And I'll read you a brief quote, because this is the first time that, and they were to advise the mayor and indirectly then the city council. It's the mayor's task force, but and one of the items that the Human Rights Commission, with the writing help of Eric, managed to get in the final report was this statement. The City of Eugene Task Force agrees that housing is a basic human right, as recognized in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights adopted by the United Nations in 1948 with the U.S. government's leadership. This right to housing is to be progressively implemented as resources allow. Because basic, adequate shelter for all who need it is a core minimum requirement of this right, the city should constantly strive to address this need. Other rights, such as freedom from cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment, should be immediately implemented, including immediately ceasing punishing homeless persons for basic life activities like sleeping or eating in public when they have nowhere else to go. And that's kind of like where I want to segue to is this latter part of the statement, which really deals with the whole issue of criminalization. So I'll mention three examples of criminalization that there have been struggles over on the part of Occupy Eugene and offshoots of Occupy Eugene and the Human Rights Commission and so forth. The first is a camping ordinance, We have an ordinance in Eugene that says there's no camping on public property at all. And of course, private property, it would need to be with permission of the private owners. This means, since we have very limited shelter space, there's one shelter in Eugene, it's run by a religious organization, and a couple of very small shelters, one for families and one for youth. With 2,000 to 3,000 homeless people living in Eugene, there's really no place for most people to go and for places for people to sleep or be during the day, especially when the weather is like it is now. So the protests resulted in some loosening of the camping ban. The city agreed to turn some property over temporarily for a village. They're calling it Opportunity Village Eugene, which will house some 45 people. And they're being housed not only in tents, but in small, tiny houses, I guess as they're called, and also in Conestoga wagons. People in Eugene are very creative, and they have made things that look like Conestoga wagons that can go on the back of a trailer and be pulled and placed. And they're being placed not only in the village, but also on church parking lots and places behind nonprofit organizations and anywhere that'll take. And they each house up to 2 people. So that's been going on. The city has also agreed to establish 2 what they're calling rest stops, which are places which would be city property again, which would house up to 15 people. Neither of those have opened yet, but the first one's due to open December 20th. Car camping has also been expanded within the city. But there's still a lot of protesting going on because obviously the magnitude of what's being offered by the city does not match the magnitude of the problem. And to give you one brief quote on the part of an advocate in the city, she says, in Portland, the mayor is trying to rent a building for the homeless campers in their downtown. And that's true, the mayor of Portland was doing that in Oregon. In Eugene, she says, the plan is to evict the homeless camp in our downtown. There's a big protest camp of 50 people downtown. 5 days before Christmas, with nowhere legal for them to go indoors or out. And she ends by saying, and I think this should be a t-shirt in Eugene, human rights city, my ass. So you can see that the whole concept of the human rights rhetoric and human rights language really is being used, that probably is not the best example, really is being used in Eugene. The second example I'll give of criminalization is the creation of a downtown public safety zone by the city council. It was created in 2008, more popularly known as the exclusion zone, some 20 square blocks where police could cite or arrest people for crimes ranging from public urination to drug possession and drug trading and so forth. In other words, from very minor crimes to more serious types of crimes. Again, there were protests against this in part because the police could exclude people from this 20-block area without the person ever having been in court. Exclude people for 90 days. And then at some point they would go to court and the judge would decide whether or not they should continue to be excluded or should be excluded permanently, or for a year, I think it was. Obviously, due process disappears in this whole thing. If the police can find you guilty and punish you by excluding you from being able to go downtown, you've lost certain fundamental human rights and civil rights. There was enough protest over that the city council finally decided to temporarily extend it, and it just was allowed to sunset on November 30th. And there was a committee that's making recommendations to the city council for alternatives, and one of the alternatives is a community court where people who were committing minor offenses could either receive help for their substance abuse or mental health issues, or could do community service or some other kind of alternative. And then the last thing I'll mention, you took more than 10 minutes. The last thing I'll mention is this, sorry. Interesting, I didn't get the original brochure, but I really like this. It says, protect your property with TLC. TLC. What TLC actually stands for is Trespass Letter of Consent. Business owners can sign a trespass letter of consent, which allows the police, if they see somebody on this property, sleeping in the doorway or whatever, can either cite the person or arrest the person or just simply harass and remove the person. And the property owner doesn't have to be present, doesn't even have to necessarily know that it's occurring, unless it's an arrest, in which case the property owner has to sign a complaint. So that's kind of been used to sort of move people on and around the city. And I just learned before I came to this conference that it's also being used by private security agencies. There's 2 private security companies in Eugene, one hired by Downtown Eugene Incorporated and the other hired by individual businesses that are actually using the trespass letter of consent to harass and to move people from downtown. And then finally, I'll just close by saying that the Human Rights Commission this year has endorsed the idea of the Homeless Bill of Rights for the state of Oregon, and we'll be working on that campaign. We've also decided to look into the possibility of a local Homeless Bill of Rights, to look into the possibility of making the unhoused a protected class under our existing human rights ordinance, and to work with the Eugene Police Department on ways to identify and track crimes that are being committed against people who are homeless, because at present there's absolutely no way in which that's kept track of. So thank you.
Thank you. My name is Anita Beaty, and I'm the Executive Director of the Metro Atlanta Task Force for the Homeless. My voice is almost gone, so I'm going to try to be really brief and then share the microphone and the experience and the description of what we're going through and have been going through for decades now as an advocacy, activist, and service provider organization. I want to mention the fact that the National Coalition has participated with the Law Center in many of these actions and most of the reports. And in terms of the activism that goes from the litigation and the education and the policy work, the National Coalition is unique in a couple of ways, in that we organize ourselves as a group that includes homeless people in the field, on the streets, in the service provider organizations, and wherever we are. So we've been organizing to help implement the changes in public policy from the international, national, and local perspective since the early 80s. And with the Law Center as the legal arm, and more than that, the policy advocacy and part of the organizing with local, state, and international groups as well. So we've been part of that movement all along, but I want to concentrate on what's gone on that parallels that history in Atlanta. The real defining moment in Atlanta was when the Olympic Games was announced in Atlanta. And I'm 71. I've been doing this work for 30 years. And so when all of us who've been trying to combine service delivery and advocacy, which is, as many of you know, very difficult, and when the power structure wants to separate us from each other, that's the first place they go. We hear all the time, you can't bite the hand that feeds you. You can't take public money and also tell the truth about what your local government, forget the state government, the national government, and the international structures are doing to damage the very people you are and serve. And I got to confess right now, we're the poster child for how not to do it. How not to do it, because if you do it the way we've done it over the years, you'll be demonized, you'll lose all your public funding, and you'll be relegated to living in a community with only volunteers who are residents of that community, who have all the strength and the skills and the creativity and the leadership abilities that we all ever needed to be able to retire and go away and say, okay, you got it. Now let's protect this facility so that you've got a place to have it. The perfect storm that began to happen in '91, and I'll just really briefly go through this, was the announcement of the Olympic Games. And my activist friends in Toronto and all over the world who'd been through that world event disaster for poor and land-deprived, tenure-insecure people all over the world said, where were you? Were you asleep when your local folks were organizing to bring the Olympics to Atlanta? where were you all? And we said it was all done privately. And that's the word that haunts us to today. So private organizing of a world event like that without any real access, which is one of the only things governments are for, to give us at the local level with voting rights or participation rights access to that structure. And we can use the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, and many other texts to prove that. The only excuse for government is to give the people access to paved roads, which if I did that in my local community would be a disaster, to things that we all need access to without even thinking, that we can agree together we need. And from there down, it takes a fruit basket turnover constantly to keep that access alive and that participation possible. So what we watched from 91 till this moment was the methodical exclusion of people of color, class exclusion, race exclusion, and housing exclusion, excuse me, healthcare exclusion, transportation exclusion, and now education exclusion, almost in that order, and in a methodical, excuse me, in a methodical way. So much so that right now, the first thing we lost in Atlanta and in Georgia was the right to housing, which was on the books from 1949 when it was put on the federal books as well, till presently. It still exists there. But in practice, beginning in 1991, when the Olympics was announced, thank you, the plan to privatize all of public housing in Atlanta was put in place. And it was completed nearly in 2005. So that by 2005, we have no more, essentially, no more public housing in Atlanta. Every bit of the physically subsidized housing is gone. What came in place was mixed-use housing, where the minimum was supposedly legally, but then the HUD policies changed too. 19 to 30% of the folks who came back into that housing were supposed to be original residents. Well, at every point in this process, those of us who were on the ground doing the work and watching, well, trying to protect the canaries in the mine who are homeless people, you know, if the worst, most extreme symptoms of poverty in Atlanta are living without housing, living without health care, living without transportation, and now finally living without education. So we've watched, we have participated, we have organized, we've been in the conversations, and we have lost every single battle. And one of the reasons, I think Dr. Steffen's going to trace how that happened, because, thank you, because we've been at the ground level doing that organizing, trying to do the activism, the policy work, the inserting ourselves and others into those policy discussions, even trying registering people to vote, which we do by definition. Anybody who comes into our huge facility, which is the only place in Atlanta left for people to be safe from arrest, to get inside a 95,000 square foot facility and be given or offered support services that are offered by the same people who live there, who've been trained as service providers and caseworkers and are now getting jobs in that network. But once you get into the system, you either grow scales or you wear yourself out trying to participate in every aspect of that system to change it. At the same time, you save lives and educate folks to be part of that system. So this is the best example, this conference, of how we can insert ourselves into the process at the human rights level, which takes work. It isn't automatic. It isn't automatic for housing advocates to include homeless people or homelessness organizations either, because the first place we lost the battle was in the right to housing at the local level. Now we have a governor who refused Medicaid expansion. We've lost the health care battle, and Grady Hospital, which was our only charity health care provider, is being defunded by the local county commission, is taking insurance only, and there is no insurance for homeless people because Medicaid is not being expanded. So all of these things that can come together to create the perfect storm for the canaries who are still in the mine, y'all. I mean, folks are getting out. They're getting out and getting housing and getting jobs and turning their lives around. But the huge majority of folks, thank you, are becoming homeless. HUD's report recently that homelessness is down in numbers is absolutely the worst document I've seen in a long time. The Interagency Council's document that supports that document, same thing. And those of us at the federal and international level and at the local level have to say it. But when you say it, you lose all of your funding, not just public, but private. And our story, the lawsuit we're engaged in now, is a story that sounds like a soap opera, because I'm a demon, our agency's a demon, and we are still there. We are in court, we go to court with a jury on February 17th to argue this human rights issue, this civil rights issue, this practical on-the-ground tortious interference and RICO issue, and we're there. So we want to just cry out and say this is the perfect audience and forum in which to bring that issue to you. And now let me ask Dr. Steffen. He is our historian for us, for all of us activists on all these issues, and on our board of directors, so he's my boss. Chuck, thank you.
I'm really excited after listening to Eric and Ken, and I took lots of notes here, because I think that each of them, in his own way, was offering us here in Atlanta a way of getting out of a sort of predicament or a sort of dead end in which we've found ourselves, politically speaking. You know, human rights discourse is a double-edged sword. I don't know if you've found, if that rings true in your experiences, but obviously it's something that you can use as a very effective instrument for expanding all rights at all sorts of levels and bringing a social justice perspective to all kinds of matters that otherwise might be compartmentalized. But human rights discourse is also something that can be very easily co-opted by groups who in fact don't share that social justice perspective. And a little bit of what you were saying, Ken, about Eugene kind of signals that, you know, the business communities in particular and city regimes serving as their allies are eager to embrace any kind of public relations scheme that will put their city on the map. And so, you know, touting Boston or touting Pittsburgh or touting Atlanta as a center of human rights can be very appealing to those kinds of groups, which puts us, obviously, in a different kind of, puts us in a particular bind. So if I could just give you an example of how that kind of dilemma has been presented to us here in Atlanta. Within recent years, Atlanta has approved a project to build a what's called a Civil and Human Rights Museum. Now, this Civil and Human Rights Museum is a project that's enjoyed support across a broad cross-section of major power structure actors. The mayor at the time, Shirley Franklin, was an avid supporter. She continues to support it, as does the current mayor, Kasim Reed. It's also backed by the downtown business community, United Way, the various philanthropic organizations that are very closely connected to downtown corporate power. This museum is going to be located at Centennial Park, which was one of the material legacies of the 1996 Olympics, which has its own history that I don't want to get into right now. But those of you who are out-of-towners who may have visited Centennial Park will note that it is also the home of the World of Coca-Cola. It's the home of the Georgia Aquarium, which is a pet project of Bernie Marcus, former owner of Home Depot. The Georgia Dome, Phillips Arena, are just around the corner. The Georgia Dome will, in the next couple of years, give way to a new football palace for Arthur Blank, Bernie Marcus's former partner. I bring that up just to say, to point out a couple of ironies here. Right on the edge of Centennial Park is an institution that for the last, I guess since the 40s, so 60 years, has been providing services to homeless people. It's called the Atlanta Union Mission. And the Atlanta Union Mission has been sort of like, the wandering. I mean, they have been forced over the decades to relocate as a consequence of pressure that's been applied by the business community. And back in the 1980s, they were forced to leave their downtown site for this new location, which at the time was sort of on the western edge of the central business district and seemed to be out of the path of downtown revitalization. So once again, the Atlanta Union Mission is facing pressure to relocate one more time because this Museum of Civil and Human Rights will be located directly across the street. All right, so that's, I mean, the ironies just cause you, to just, your head starts spinning after a while. The reason that I'm so excited hearing what Eric and Ken had to say is that it makes clear to me that the only way you can push back on that kind of rather cynical manipulation and co-optation of human rights discourse is to establish the kinds of connections that we've been hearing about here. I mean, if you can, as Eric was telling us, plug into and form good active alliances and good coalitions with international groups, with national groups, if you're able to establish that kind of independent presence, as Ken was telling us, in a place like Eugene, well, that seems to me to be a useful, worthwhile, and potentially effective way of avoiding the dangerous elements of the human rights discourse, dangerous in the sense that they can be co-opted by groups whose visions we might not share, and really maximizing the emancipatory potential of human rights discourse. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.